On a cold and windy morning in November of 2015, 28-year-old Eufaula, Oklahoma resident Peggy McGuire loaded her young son up into her truck and made the 20-minute drive to drop him off at elementary school. She hugged him tight, told him she loved him, and said she'd see him later that afternoon when he got out of class. After leaving the school, Peggy placed a call to her father, where they discussed plans to add a deck to the back of her home. He was more than happy to oblige, but he'd need certain measurements which Peggy promised to record as soon as she got home. However, sometime later that morning, the single mother seemed to mysteriously vanish from the face of the earth. All calls to Peggy kicked back with no answer, and it appeared her phone had been powered off, something she never did. Following desperate attempts from her mother, father, co-worker, and friends, she was officially reported missing. It was soon determined that Peggy did in fact make it back to her home north of Eufaula in the Stidham area, but from there, no one could say with any certainty what may have happened. Days after her disappearance, Peggy's truck was found abandoned at a bar not far from her home. Surveillance footage showed an unidentified figure leaving the vehicle and disappearing into the early morning darkness. While law enforcement initially theorized that the 28-year-old may have left of her own volition, it didn't take long for her family and much of the local community to set their sights elsewhere on the missing woman's ex-boyfriend and the father of her child, with whom she was sharing a home at the time. Was Peggy the victim of a random act of violence, or did a history of domestic abuse finally lead to a violent end for the dedicated nurse and mother? This is Trace Evidence, episode 247, The Disappearance of Peggy McGuire. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. In today's episode, we dive into the mysterious disappearance of 28-year-old Peggy McGuire. Last seen dropping her son off at school on the morning of Monday, November 16th, 2015. Nearly 10 years have passed since she was last seen alive, and law enforcement is no closer to solving that mystery. This is episode 247, The Disappearance of Peggy McGuire. Peggy Anne McGuire was born on Thanksgiving Day, Thursday, November 27, 1986, in McIntosh County, Oklahoma, to parents Betty and Larry McGuire. Peggy was the final of 3 children born to the couple, with her being welcomed home by 2 older siblings, Richard and Amanda. Peggy would go on to be raised in Eufaula, a small city home to less than 3,000 residents that also functions as the seat of McIntosh County. According to friends and family, Peggy was an immeasurably kind, caring, and sweet young woman who loved laughing, spending time with her family, and being around animals, who held a special place in her heart. The baby of the family, Peggy's blonde hair and bright blue eyes captivated family and friends from the get-go, with many describing her as appearing like a little princess. While she possessed a gentle touch and an undeniable charm, everyone who knew the young woman would go on to note that she was far from a priss, instead describing her as a little bit of a tomboy. When speaking to Crime Watch Daily for a segment they produced some years back, family members said she was, quote, a country girl through and through. She loved the outdoors and had a deep affinity for fishing, hunting, and camping. She loved being out in the wilderness, exploring and experiencing the world through the beautiful lens of nature. In addition to her zest for a country life, she was also a talented and skilled athlete who performed extremely well academically and shared a love for farming, specifically when it came to taking care of the animals. Country living, as several have described it, was very close to her heart, and it would ultimately be through that appreciation that she'd come to meet the boy who would later play a major role in her future and perhaps the unknown circumstances surrounding her disappearance. According to the family, Peggy was never very close with her biological father, Larry. Her parents' divorce was finalized in May of 1991 when she was just 4 years old, and for the vast majority of her life, she'd be raised by her mother and her new husband, Donnie Davis. Peggy developed a tight bond with Donnie, who she always referred to as her father, never employing the word step, which speaks volumes about the closeness and importance of their relationship. For his part, Donnie felt the same way about Peggy, doting on the youngster and treating her as if she were his own because, in almost every way, she was. As a child, Peggy attended Eufaula Elementary School, where she quickly developed a large and tight circle of friends. Through school, she would be introduced to basketball, which quickly captured her attention, becoming her preferred sport and one at which she excelled. Betty, while being interviewed on Unfound, noted that in the 3rd grade, her daughter developed a close friendship with a girl named Samantha, the sister of Thomas Ryan McIntosh. She would often sleep over this friend's house, and over time, her relationship with Thomas evolved from a childish crush into something more significant. The two would go on to attend Eufaula High School at the same time, and it was during their sophomore year that they took the leap from friends on the edge of a relationship to actively dating. While Peggy was excited, for the most part it appears, neither her friends nor family were crazy about this budding young love. According to her mother, the two clicked because of their friendly history and their share of mutual interest, specifically that country living lifestyle. It probably didn't hurt that, given the last names of McGuire and McIntosh, the two were often seated or announced one right next to the other. Elizabeth Leeper, Peggy's cousin and dear friend, was less tactful, telling Crime Watch Daily, quote, "She was beautiful, beautiful. She could have had any guy she wanted, and he was so awkward, rude, and unsocial," end quote. It appears that issues between the young couple began early on, with several of Peggy's friends saying that McIntosh was possessive, jealous, and had a tendency towards violence. Reportedly, if Peggy spent time with or even talked too long with another guy, McIntosh would take offense, and this would often kick off intense arguments and shouting matches. Elizabeth Leeper relayed details of the one time in which she bore witness to the results of that volatile relationship. Leeper claimed that during one lunch break, things turned physical and Peggy was assaulted. She explained, saying, quote, "They come back from lunch and her nose was bloody. She made me take her to the ER. Later, she told me that he had gotten mad at her and he took a pistol and backhanded her with the back end of the pistol." End quote. Although this particular incident wasn't directly addressed, Betty would describe it as par for the course, saying that over the years she had witnessed intense arguments between the two. She alleged that at different times, McIntosh had smashed in car windows, kicked in doors, and destroyed Peggy's property. While her relationship with McIntosh was troubled, to say the least, every other aspect of the teen's life appeared to be coming together. Another area of interest shared by she and McIntosh was sports, specifically basketball. To put it lightly, Peggy was an extremely talented player, and a quick search through local archives finds her name mentioned frequently in high school sports sections in local papers. She played a strong game and was aided by the physicality that her mother says she inherited from her biological father, namely, growing to stand an impressive 5 feet 10 inches tall. Although Peggy loved the game and played it as often as she could, it did wear on her physically. The physical demand on her knees was difficult, and by the time she was in her mid-20s, she would have to undergo surgery to completely replace her right knee. Academically, Peggy performed extremely well. Over the years, she's frequently named as belonging to the National Honor Society. Her strongest subjects were English and science, both of which she had a keen interest in. In addition to academics and sports, Peggy was also involved in a lot of different groups and programs, with yearbooks showing her as a member of the yearbook committee, homecoming royalty, and the future farmers of America. Graduating from Eufaula High School in the spring of 2005, Peggy was excited about the future and had big plans. However, she would unfortunately find herself caught up in a vicious circle with her increasingly toxic relationship with Thomas McIntosh. According to Peggy's mother, following high school, the relationship with McIntosh continued to get worse, with the couple arguing more frequently and McIntosh's behaviors becoming more erratic and violent. When being interviewed on Unfound, hosted by Ed Dentzel, Betty reported that multiple people tried to convince Peggy to end things with McIntosh and to try to get her to stay away from him. When the couple did split up, they'd stay apart for weeks to months, but somehow they would always come back together. And while the relationship would seem all right in the beginning, things would always turn back to arguments, threats, and physical violence. In some instances, people have described the relationship as being little more than a friends with benefits situation following high school, whereas others have said it all depended on what time of year it was. Sometimes it was just a casual thing. Other times it was more committed and followed the framework of a regular relationship, regardless of the disturbing and violent incidents. Although the relationship was obviously an unhealthy one for years, things crossed a red line for Peggy sometime in the early months of 2006, less than a year after graduating high school. While the inciting incident has not been reported on, Oklahoma court records reveal that on Wednesday, April 5th, Peggy filed a petition seeking a protective order against McIntosh. It appears that a temporary order of protection was issued that day, and on Monday, April 17th, court records reflect that both Peggy and McIntosh appeared before Judge Jean Mowery. On Monday, May 1st, the temporary order of protection was upgraded to a permanent protective order. Unfortunately, it seems that, as had previously been the case, regardless of who tried to intervene or what actions were taken, Peggy and McIntosh would drift back towards one another. Although the two did not enter back into a committed relationship, they were seeing each other again, and it was during a calm period between the two that Peggy became pregnant with her first and only child, a son she would name Ethan. This appears to have somewhat changed the dynamic between Peggy and McIntosh, with them wanting to try and work things out so that they could raise their child together. However, there were some issues straight from the beginning. According to Betty, while McIntosh was well aware that Peggy was pregnant with his son, she continued living with her mother and he with his parents, who were not told about the pregnancy for reasons which have never been explained. Following the birth of their son, the couple appeared to enter what some have referred to as a quiet period, at least in regard to getting law enforcement involved in things. While they didn't have a great history together, friends and family reported that Peggy very much wanted to provide their son with a solid, reliable, and safe family life, and she was willing to go out on a limb in the hope that things could change. Though we have no solid specifics about this period in their lives, we do know that Peggy and McIntosh remained in contact and attempted to work things out. 7 years later, in late 2013, the relationship would take a more abusive turn when the couple left the state of Oklahoma, looking to start over again nearly 800 miles from home. Betty later stated that at the time, McIntosh, who was then employed as a pipeline worker, was offered a job in Indiana. Perhaps believing that a change of scenery away from all of their past issues might offer them the opportunity to finally come together as a family, Peggy informed her family that she was going to be moving with McIntosh to Valparaiso, located in northwest Indiana. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the cycle of violence in which Peggy found herself trapped erupted once again when they were living in Indiana. Not only did things turn violent, they became worse than they had ever been before, and all of this led up to a brutal attack which occurred on Tuesday, December 17th. According to Indiana court records at the time, Peggy and McIntosh were living together in a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home located in the 400 North block of 475 West, approximately 10 miles northwest from the city center. Court records show that on Wednesday, December 18th, McIntosh was charged with 3 crimes in relation to a physical assault on Peggy. The charges were for strangulation, domestic battery committed in the presence of a child less than 16 years old, and interference with reporting a crime. It would later be alleged that during an argument, McIntosh had become violent and closed his hands around Peggy's throat, choking her while their son was in the room watching. Following this, Peggy was threatened with additional violence should she report that crime to police. On the same day these charges were filed, McIntosh was served with a no-contact order by the Porter County Sheriff's Department. Desperate to get away and in need of assistance, Peggy reached out to her family, who quickly wired her the cash necessary to travel back to Oklahoma, where she moved in with her mother. Following that assault, Peggy appeared to have drawn a line in the sand. Although she had always gone back to McIntosh, regardless of the circumstances, her loved ones thought that this time would be different. And for a period of time, it was. Her cousin Elizabeth later explained, quote, "When she came home from Indiana, she was broken and beaten, but I think something clicked finally that she was not going back, for Ethan's safety. He could have killed her." End quote. Over the course of the next few months, there appeared to be some improvement, and with McIntosh still back in Indiana, Peggy had a chance to move forward with her life without the risk of running into him or being sucked back into that cycle. This, however, would not last, and just a few months later, McIntosh returned to Oklahoma, and slowly, over a couple of months, the two began seeing each other again. While Peggy had initially pressed charges with Indiana authorities, she would drop them months later, with court records showing that the scheduled jury trial was canceled in September of 2014. On Wednesday, October 22nd, the no-contact order expired, and Peggy did not seek to extend it. 5 days later, on Monday, October 17th, Judge Julia Kent officially dismissed all 3 charges against McIntosh, leaving him only with court fees totaling $995. Just 1 year and 1 month later, Peggy McGuire would mysteriously vanish after last being seen by Thomas McIntosh. While Peggy may not have been making good decisions when it came to McIntosh, she was taking steps to advance her career so that she could provide better for her son. Always someone with a desire to help others, Peggy turned to nursing, and in June of 2015, 6 months before her disappearance, she passed her boards and became a licensed practical nurse. Peggy was employed at Wellington Hills, a nursing facility located in the 600 block of Woodland Avenue in Eufaula. She quickly accrued a reputation for being extremely hardworking, friendly, and dependable. Everything was going great for the 28-year-old single mother, but as the summer drew near to a close, things would change as, once again, McIntosh would become involved in her life. Betty explained on Unfound that just a few months after passing her boards, her daughter was contacted by McIntosh. It was August, 3 months before her disappearance, when McIntosh was reportedly laid off from work and went to live with his grandparents, then located in Eufaula. According to the family, McIntosh reached out to Peggy, claiming that he wanted to spend time with his son, who, at that point, was solely in his mother's care. Not wanting to deny her son his father, she agreed, but it didn't take long for things to become frustrating. Betty stated that McIntosh began questioning Peggy's travels, behaviors, and activities, and his jealousy began rearing its head. He wanted to know how she spent her free time. Was she flirting with other guys or maybe even dating one? Peggy explained that she wasn't going to answer those questions, that she was allowing McIntosh to see his son, and that was where their connection ended. However, when he found her to be resistant to his questions, he turned his attention to their son, asking him what he knew about his mother's activities and whether or not there were any other men hanging around. During this period of time, Peggy's work schedule became more demanding, and she started taking on double shifts. Since McIntosh was looking after Ethan more and more, he began keeping their son with him throughout Peggy's long shifts. School was back in session, and so, after finishing for the day, Ethan would go to be with his father, and then when Peggy's shift ended, generally around 11 p.m., she'd go by and pick him up. It was working, for a while, but the demand and hours were weighing on the 28-year-old. On top of that, she didn't like the idea of picking up her son so late when he needed to be in bed so he could be prepared for school the next day. A month later, in September, Peggy and McIntosh began staying together at a home she had procured northwest of the city in the town of Stidham. While the home was far from a mansion, being a modular double-wide, it was seated on nearly 80 acres of land. However, she hadn't gotten the home entirely on her own. Thomas McIntosh was listed as a co-signer on the mortgage. This would come as a surprise to Peggy's parents, who were somewhat frustrated when they learned this. They would have happily signed on to help her get her own home, especially if it would have kept her away from McIntosh. But, as had been the cycle for nearly half her life at that point in time, Peggy couldn't seem to get away from her ex. Reportedly, this decision was made mostly to try and keep things as uncomplicated as possible. Peggy made it clear to friends and family, as well as McIntosh, that she wasn't interested in rekindling any romance, nor did she have any desire to fall back into the repeated pattern of abuse. This was purely a way of keeping things together for their son, to limit the demand on her schedule and to allow McIntosh more access to the child. They would live in the home, but the space was divided between his section and hers, and she did not allow any overflow. According to Betty, McIntosh kept trying to wear Peggy down, trying to convince her to get back together, but she was more resistant than she'd ever been before, choosing to sleep in a guest room in order to keep them even more divided within the home. The location of the home allowed Peggy to have more animals who had always been near and dear to her heart. She ended up with dogs, chickens, goats, rabbits, and approximately 150 head of cattle. In addition to pulling double shifts at work, she pushed herself hard to look after all of the animals and oftentimes would bring her son along as she fed and checked in on them. Betty explained that her daughter didn't stop moving from the time she woke up in the morning until she crashed in her bed at night. She worked at the nursing home, ran the farm, was a mother, and even took time out of her schedule to volunteer as a youth basketball coach. Despite all of the arrangements, Peggy's mother was still concerned about her sharing a home with McIntosh. She expressed her feelings to her daughter, telling her she was worried that things might turn violent again and she didn't want to see her hurt, or perhaps worse. According to Betty, Peggy told her that she wasn't worried about it, alleging that she had enough information on McIntosh that if he ever tried to go at her again, she would take him for everything he had and she wouldn't be afraid to push it to the limit. When it came to the possibility of romantic feelings returning, Peggy was very quick to dismiss it. Reportedly, she explained that not only was that unlikely, after all the years of abuse and unhappiness, she'd gotten to a place where she couldn't stand to see him, hear him, or even be in the same room as him. In fact, she'd already been casually dating off and on for a while prior to McIntosh moving into the home with her, and she didn't have any intentions of cutting that off. According to her cousin, Elizabeth, Peggy was planning to get away from McIntosh for good. She hadn't quite yet figured out all of the logistics, but she wanted to get her things together and get away from the house they shared. This is somewhat of a debated point, however, as while Elizabeth told this to Crime Watch Daily, according to Betty, she wasn't aware of a plan to move out, and the day she vanished, Peggy was awaiting the delivery of more goats for her farm, something it seems unlikely she'd have scheduled if indeed she were leaving for good, but no one appears to know that for certain. This brings us to November of 2015, the month Peggy McGuire was last seen alive. According to Betty in her unfound interview, tensions between her daughter and McIntosh were growing, and an incident early in the month really kicked things up a notch. Allegedly, McIntosh's grandfather had some kind of a financial issue and needed cash quickly, and so McIntosh supposedly went down to the bank where Peggy had her account, spoke to a teller there that he had a personal relationship with, and managed to get granted access to withdraw cash from that account, something the 28-year-old never agreed to. It's been claimed that McIntosh had a lot of influence, or at least his family did. The last name McIntosh carries a lot of weight in that area. Eufaula is in McIntosh County, named after the same family. There's been a lot of things said on both sides of the equation here, but for Peggy's friends and family, they firmly believe that Thomas McIntosh invoked the family name on more than one occasion to get out of trouble or to get what he wanted. According to Betty, her daughter was furious when she learned that McIntosh had been allowed to take money out of her bank account, and in response, she went down to the branch to demand answers. What exactly happened at the bank and how things were handled has never been revealed, but it's worth noting that Peggy would mysteriously vanish just a few days later. The young nurse was scheduled to work the weekend of Saturday the 14th and Sunday the 15th, after which she was planning to get together with a man she'd recently begun seeing. Her new love interest lived in Texas, and Peggy was excited to get together with him, but she would sadly vanish before she could even make the trip. The last time Elizabeth Leeper saw her cousin was the evening of Sunday the 15th. Elizabeth also worked at the nursing facility, so she got to see Peggy a lot. That night, everything seemed to be in order, and there didn't appear to be anything wrong. Elizabeth later told Nancy Grace that she had spoken to Peggy at approximately 8 p.m., and everything appeared to be completely normal. She had no reason to be concerned about her cousin, although she did express that Peggy may have been nearing placing her moving out plan into action. She allegedly planned to pack up and move in with her mother for a period of time, but she would never get far enough to pack that suitcase. Monday, November 16th began as a cold and rainy morning in eastern Oklahoma. Winds were blowing hard, gusting up to 20 miles per hour, while the gray sky overhead grew only darker. As was normal for Peggy in the morning, her primary focus was to get Ethan ready for school and then to drop him off. Not particularly fond of the schools in the area, Peggy sent her son to a school in Canadian, located 15 miles south of Eufaula in Pittsburgh County. Given the distance, the drive averaged between 25 to 30 minutes depending on traffic. Based upon the data provided by law enforcement, it's believed that Peggy loaded up Ethan and then climbed into her 2012 Toyota Tundra pickup truck, leaving her Stidham home around 7:25 a.m. Whether or not anyone else was in the truck with her and Ethan that morning has been the subject of great debate, and for reasons passing understanding, law enforcement has never taken the initiative to make it clear one way or the other. We know that Peggy made it to the school that day. Members of the administration would later inform investigators that she dropped off Ethan, as always, at 8 a.m. Now, early reports stated that when Peggy drove away from the school that morning, it was noted that there was another person in the truck with her, presumed to have been Thomas McIntosh. However, as I mentioned, this has never been clarified, and if the school had security cameras outside, the footage of her dropping off her son that morning has never been released. All we can say with any certainty is that Peggy made it to the school, dropped off her son, and was alive and well when she was last seen driving away. The next time there's contact with Peggy is approximately 15 minutes later at 8:15 a.m. when she called and spoke with her father, Donnie Davis, while making the 30-minute drive home to Stidham. Peggy was always doing projects around her house, but next she had a plan for which she'd need help. She wanted to add a deck along with a ramp to make it easier to get into the house. She often experienced soreness following her knee replacement, and steps were a little uncomfortable for her to maneuver. In addition to that, she had an elderly dog who had injured legs and the stairs were hard on him, so she wanted to make it easier for everyone all around. Donnie was planning to put the porch and ramp together, but in order to do so, he'd need some specific measurements. Peggy told Donnie that when she got home, she'd measure it all out and then call him back with the details, but that call never came. The next person to have communication with Peggy that morning was her cousin Elizabeth, who later stated that she spoke to the missing woman via text message. According to Elizabeth, she had a patient-specific question regarding one of the individuals at the nursing facility, so she texted to ask. Peggy replied to that text, and it's believed that it was in fact Peggy sending the message because she was able to answer the question correctly. The last person confirmed to have spoken to Peggy that morning was the Texas man that she'd been seeing. According to him, they spoke on the phone sometime not long after 8:30. He went on to state that Peggy was back at her house when they spoke and that she had specifically told him she was making deer jerky for him. There was nothing to indicate any problems at the time, and the Texas man later told authorities that he received another call and told Peggy he'd call her back when he was done. Approximately 40 minutes later, he did call back, but the phone went straight to voicemail. This would suggest the phone was either damaged or powered off, the latter of which is something friends and family know Peggy would never do while her son was in school. She'd be too worried about a possible emergency call being missed. Elizabeth noted how odd this was, saying, quote, "For her phone to be off for days or even just a day is just not like her," end quote. After 9 a.m. that morning, there is no one who ever reported speaking with or seeing Peggy alive. She had previously made plans with her mother to attend a basketball game that night where her niece was playing. Although Peggy had told her mother she'd be late, she never showed up, nor did she call or text to explain her absence. Betty tried to get in touch with her daughter that night, but multiple texts went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail. Although it was very out of character for Peggy to not show up and to be out of contact, Betty was worried, but she didn't immediately jump to the conclusion that something horrible had happened. While her concerns were growing, Peggy's cousin Elizabeth wasn't too worried. Although she was unable to get the 28-year-old on the phone, she was privy to information that Betty may not have been. According to Elizabeth, Peggy had told her that she was planning to spend time with her new boyfriend on Monday, and she'd already said in advance that she would not be coming into work on Tuesday so they could spend more time together. On this same day, Betty decided to call McIntosh to ask if he knew her daughter's whereabouts, but he denied any knowledge. According to Betty, McIntosh told her that he hadn't seen Peggy since the weekend, and he'd just assumed that she was working. This didn't make a lot of sense to Betty since, even if she were working extra hours, she still would need to go home, and she would be dropping off and picking up Ethan from school. This answer certainly set off alarms for the worried mother, who would later tell NBC News, quote, "I couldn't get her on Monday or Tuesday, and neither could anyone else," end quote. The morning of Wednesday, the 18th, marked 48 hours since anyone was able to reach Peggy, and by this point, Betty wasn't the only one worried. Elizabeth was surprised when Peggy didn't show up for work that day. She was always on time and cared deeply about her job, so this was the first major red flag for the missing woman's cousin. Not long into the day, Betty rang the nursing home and spoke to several of Peggy's co-workers, all of whom acknowledged that they had not seen or heard from the single mother since the weekend. Frustrated, Betty and Donnie got into their car and made the trip over to the house in Stidham to see if they could track down Peggy. Upon arriving, they noted that her truck was nowhere to be seen, and neither was McIntosh's. Inside, they found the house in good condition. Peggy's stuff was still there, neat and organized, and they could find nothing to indicate any signs of a struggle. Everything was oddly normal, but this did little to alleviate Betty's worries. Out of options and scared, Betty decided to contact the McIntosh County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. Right from the get-go, no one was happy with how law enforcement handled things. For the most part, they didn't express much concern and were of the belief that Peggy was an adult and she'd likely gone somewhere on her own, telling the family she'd probably be back on her own within a few days. In addition, law enforcement noted that they would put out a bolo on Peggy and her truck, but that without a starting point for a search, there wasn't a whole lot they could do. Should new information be obtained giving them an area to focus on, they would, but until then, it was too wide open for organized searches. Hearing this, the family didn't want to sit around waiting, so they began working the investigation themselves. Relatives and friends, co-workers, and neighbors were contacted, and many of them made the trip to Eufaula, some from as far away as California. They produced flyers which were quickly put up all over town, on power poles, in-store windows, and even handed out to people passing by. They began organizing volunteer search parties and created a private Facebook group, Bring Peggy Home, to help coordinate. Although several days had passed since Peggy had last been seen, everyone was focused on finding her, no matter what extreme they had to go to. As it would turn out, the very next day, Thursday, November 19th, would yield the first major clue in the 28-year-old's disappearance. Peggy's brother, Richard, was driving around the area searching for any sign of his sister when he spotted her truck in a strange and unlikely location. TNJ's Ice House was a small, country-style bar that seated approximately 20 people. Located just shy of 10 miles from Peggy's house off Highway 9 along County Road 4130, it was an establishment mostly frequented by locals. It was kind of a dive, a hole in the wall. The building itself appeared to have been a haphazard blend of a trailer merged with a metal storage container. There, in the back of the parking lot, in a space furthest from the building, Richard saw his sister's truck. The location of the truck stood out, not just because Peggy was missing, but because this was far from the kind of place she would normally go. Richard later commented, quote, "She has never been in that place," end quote. Not to mention, Peggy wasn't a drinker, so why she'd have been at the bar was a question no one was able to answer outside of a poor quality surveillance camera mounted on the front of the business. Law enforcement was notified of the discovery, and deputies from the sheriff's department were dispatched to the location, where they found Peggy's family already there waiting for them. The owner of the bar explained to authorities that the truck had been parked there since the early morning of Tuesday the 17th, and they had no idea who'd left it there. In fact, since several days had passed without the vehicle's owner showing up or calling, they were preparing to have the truck towed. Although there was surveillance footage, it was grainy and difficult to make out. The footage showed Peggy's truck driving up Country Road 4130, heading north, suggesting it had come from Highway 9 to the south at approximately 5:20 a.m. There was a heavy rainstorm that morning, obscuring the video further, but law enforcement noted that the vehicle made a left, turning into the bar's parking lot, at which time it creeped slowly into the space where it was later found. The video showed an unidentified person exiting from the driver's side, at which time the truck's lights flashed as though the key fob was used to lock or unlock the doors. The unidentified individual then pulled up the hood on his hoodie, put his hands in his pockets, and began walking back towards County Road he had just come from. Although it's extremely difficult to make out much in the footage, several family members immediately indicated that they believed the driver to be Thomas McIntosh. Law enforcement, however, even nearly a decade later, have never been able to positively identify the driver. Following discovery of the truck, McIntosh was informed since, much like the house, he was also the co-signer, and he too came down to the bar to see what was going on. While there, he was allegedly taken into one of the deputies' vehicles, at which point he was questioned. Although specific details about the line of questioning have never been revealed, it has been stated that McIntosh denied any involvement in Peggy's disappearance and claimed that he hadn't seen her since the weekend, the same thing he had told Betty. McIntosh did, however, posit a theory with investigators. Reportedly, he stated his belief that Peggy had chosen to run off with a new guy she'd been seeing. This was something no one believed, since if there was one thing anyone who knew Peggy knew for sure, it was that she would never abandon her son. He was the center of her entire world. Interestingly, it's been reported that in the aftermath of the truck's discovery, Ethan was asked about his mother and what he may or may not have known. Allegedly, the child stated that his father told him that his mother had run off with another guy before the truck was found at the bar. Despite this, law enforcement didn't seem to take the child's account too seriously, noting that his statement was indeed interesting but not reliable enough to move on. Essentially, should things move forward to a trial, it wasn't believed Ethan would be able to testify reliably enough. Without some corroboration, there was little they could do. Hoping for answers, the sheriff's department impounded the truck that evening and took it in for a thorough examination in search of any additional evidence. However, the family had been quickly losing confidence in local law enforcement, given their initial reaction to the missing persons report and their failure to launch even a single search to that point in time. Following the truck's discovery, there were still no official searches launched, and so Betty made it her goal to get the OSBI, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, involved. On Unfound, she explained that she begged county authorities to call in state investigators and went so far as to call local politicians, leaving voicemails that went unanswered. What ultimately brought the OSBI to Eufaula was not the sheriff's department, nor any real actions from law enforcement. Instead, when a news reporter came to town to cover the story and learned how poor the investigation had been handled, she reached out to someone she knew at the OSBI and they agreed to get involved, but they wouldn't show up until nearly a month after the disappearance. Pamela Bradford, a local woman who lived in close proximity to T&J's ice house, saw the story on the local news and quickly picked up the phone to contact authorities. According to Bradford, she was driving along County Road 4130 the morning the truck was left at the bar, and she saw something odd. Despite the fact that it was raining and storming pretty good, she spotted an unidentified man walking along the side of the road heading away from the bar. Assuming it was someone experiencing car trouble, Bradford began to slow her vehicle down to offer the man a ride, at which point he quickly ducked off the side of the road, hiding in a thicket of weeds and bushes. Bradford found the behavior strange, but at the time, she had no reason to think much more about it and continued on her way. Despite the discovery of the truck and examination of the surveillance footage, local law enforcement still wasn't doing much in terms of investigating. In response, members of Peggy's family began organizing more searches and actions. They gathered at the Stidham Community Center, utilizing it as a base camp for future plans and operations. Asked about their plans, Kelly Cunell, a cousin of Peggy's, told ABC News, quote, "We're searching areas we think people would hide her or people would want to get rid of her or something. We don't have any leads. We don't know. We're just searching areas around her house. We desperately need some information, and we would do anything to get that. Without hope, what else do we have to stand on? I mean, we have to hope and pray that we can bring her home alive, and that's why time is of the essence." End quote. The family's search expanded out beyond the bounds of the property Peggy owned, moving into property owned by neighbors. The neighbors were asked and eagerly gave approval for searches to be conducted and, in most cases, chipped in and helped out, knowing their property better than others. More expansive searches were handled through the use of four-wheelers, which, in the course of the first week, logged hundreds of miles in their search for any clues or signs of the missing mother. Dorothy Hall, Peggy's aunt, explained, quote, "They've been out on everybody's property searching in their ponds, along their fence lines, looking for anything wherever they think she could be. They've talked to residents, they've put up posters, handed out flyers. Everything has been done with family organization." End quote. With the family carrying the vast majority of the load as pertains to the searches, and with, from their perspective, the lack of action from the sheriff's department, They began putting together plans to get outside investigators into the area. Just a few days before Thanksgiving, marking a week since Peggy's disappearance, the family set up and publicized a GoFundMe page where they included their interest in hiring professional assistants. Speaking to the McAllister News Capital and Democrat, Betty expressed the pain and frustration of a mother desperate to bring her daughter home, saying, quote, "Today, it's been a week since my baby girl has been missing. I'd give anything to see her beautiful face again and to hear her say, 'I love you, Mama.' I won't stop looking for you. I miss you with all my heart. I hope you're safe and warm." End quote. In regard to the lack of sincere investigation, McIntosh County Sheriff Kevin Ledbetter was asked about the status of the case. At the time, he wasn't able to give much information, though he did state that both Peggy's truck and the surveillance footage was being handed over to the OSBI, who planned to conduct a thorough search of the vehicle and would work to try and clean up and enhance the video of the unknown man. Ledbetter noted that warrants were already being sought, not only linked to the vehicle, but also for Peggy's cell phone data, which they hope might help narrow down her last location. It was announced that several different search groups, many in Oklahoma and some from neighboring Arkansas, openly volunteered their services to come and conduct more thorough searches. However, there was a problem. The Sheriff's Department had not yet requested their help because, as Sheriff Ledbetter noted, they didn't have a good enough idea of where she may have disappeared from or where she might be. So there was no specific location at which to stage such a comprehensive search. Sheriff Ledbetter told local reporters that once they had more information on potential locations, then he might be inclined to request assistance from the volunteer groups. Peggy's 29th birthday came and passed on Friday the 27th. It was a grim reminder for the family of what they were fighting for and the desperation they felt to locate the missing mother. Monday, November 30th marked 2 weeks since the mother of one had last been seen, and outside of the discovery of her truck, almost nothing had been uncovered. The Stidham Community Center, their home base, was going to be closing, and so the family began trying to find a new location from which to operate. In hopes of drawing more attention to the search, co-workers from Wellington Hills sold baked goods over the weekend, earning $2,000 to continue funding searches. According to them, everyone loved Peggy, and they were glad to help with their co-worker, Cindy Passion, stating, quote, "We are all friends. We all hang out together. Peggy was kind of special. The residents loved her. They even have her flyers hanging on their doors." End quote. The owner of the nursing facility, who noted how hardworking and dedicated Peggy was, contributed to that effort, donating a reward of $15,000 for information leading to Peggy's location. Frustrated with the developing narrative of law enforcement inaction, Sheriff Ledbetter spoke with NBC News, at which time he stated they were in fact investigating the case, saying they had issued warrants for Peggy's cell phone data on the 19th, 3 days after she was last seen. He also added that they were in the process of filing warrants for her financial records and social media accounts. Asked about the lack of searches, Ledbetter stated they needed a better starting point because otherwise they'd be randomly searching anywhere within the 350 square miles that make up McIntosh County. Sheriff Ledbetter continued, saying, quote, "We've been working it from day one. The problem is we don't have a point to really go off of. Once we do, we will launch whatever resources are necessary to investigate it further. We are following up with any and all leads we get." End quote. A little over a week later, on Tuesday, December 8th, the OSBI descended upon McIntosh County and was joined by multiple law enforcement agencies to conduct the first major organized official search since Peggy disappeared 22 days earlier. The search would center primarily on Peggy's home and the approximate 80 acres surrounding it. However, warrants were sought and obtained for neighboring properties as well. Reportedly, The search was focused primarily in that area because law enforcement finally obtained Peggy's cell phone data, and it showed that the last time her phone was active was on the morning of her disappearance, and tower signals showed that the phone was in or nearby to her home just prior to the signal shutting off. The OSBI, along with the McIntosh County Sheriff's Department, the Muskogee Creek Nation Light Horse Police, local firefighters, and volunteers gathered early Tuesday morning at the Stidham Baptist Church to organize plans and hand out directions and orders in what they described as a massive but focused hunt for clues and evidence. A command center was set up in the church parking lot, which included a mobile analysis trailer and a crime scene investigation vehicle. Warrants were to be served and searches would involve drones, cadaver dogs, helicopters, and four-wheelers. There were foot searches, and beyond that, boats equipped with sonar was sent into nearby bodies of water and ponds in the area. Among the searchers was also an anthropologist who worked out of the medical examiner's office. Jenny Verdon, a spokesperson for the OSBI, stated that the search would focus on Peggy's last known location. When asked about possible suspects or persons of interest, Verdon declined to comment. The searches were conducted over the course of the 8th and 9th, though what evidence or information they yielded was not immediately revealed. 2 days after completion, on Friday, December 11th, a candlelight vigil was held. More than 100 people, including family, friends, and concerned local citizens, attended and were led in prayer by Minister Dusty McKeefer. 2 people conspicuous by their absence were Thomas McIntosh and Peggy's son Ethan. Asked about her grandson, Betty noted that he was now living with his father in the home that he'd previously shared with Peggy. It was also announced on that day that the reward for information in the case had been increased to $20,000. A few weeks later, in mid-January, details of what was recovered during the searches and what areas specifically were targeted was released. The home Peggy shared with McIntosh was the primary search location, and law enforcement reported the recovery of several curious items. In the home, they found and took samples of 6 separate blood-like stains found on couch cushions and an unspecified area of the back porch. In addition to these swabs, they also recovered a .357 Ruger revolver. In addition to the home, a warrant was served on Thomas McIntosh's truck, from which law enforcement reported retrieving a pair of yellow leather gloves with what appeared to be bloodstains on them from beneath one of the vehicle's seats. Another vehicle searched was a Kubota brand tractor, from which they took samples of blood-like material located in the front loading bucket. The OSBI also served warrants on the cell phones, computers, and bank statements of both Peggy and McIntosh. All told, 7 different properties were searched, and while the evidence didn't quite paint a clear portrait, Sheriff Ledbetter was hopeful, saying, quote, "Some of what we found may not make sense now, but it's just another piece of the puzzle." End quote. It was during this time that details of the OSBI search of Peggy's truck were also revealed for the first time. McIntosh County Deputy Sheriff Dwayne Hall stated that they did in fact swab for DNA within the vehicle and gave a full inventory of everything which had been found, which included 1 iPhone 6 box, 2 cell phone cases, 4 bottles of medication with her name on them, 1 Ziploc bag containing 3 syringes of medication, 5 spent .38 caliber shells, 4 .357 Magnum hollow point bullets, 1 key ring with 1 key on it, and 1 flash drive. While the family was excited and hopeful to see steps being taken, at least in regard to Peggy's truck, Betty wasn't quite sure just how thoroughly things were being handled. When speaking on Unfound, she stated that law enforcement contacted her and asked her to come down and pick up her daughter's personal items from the vehicle. Since it had been in police custody, no one was making payments during that time, and the vehicle was set to be repossessed. According to Betty, when she arrived, she didn't think it looked like much of a search had been done inside the truck at all. There was mud still dried on the floor mats and no trace of fingerprint dust inside. When asked about the mud, the OSBI told Betty they had taken photos of it, but they didn't take a sample for analysis because most of the dirt in that area is all the same, so it wouldn't help them narrow anything down. That made sense, to a degree, but when she asked why it didn't look like they had fingerprinted the inside, she was told that because McIntosh was the co-signer and lived with Peggy, there wasn't much of a point checking because they were guaranteed to find his prints, but that would prove nothing. Betty understood that, but couldn't help wondering, what if someone else was involved or had been responsible entirely on their own? Wouldn't it have made sense to check for any prints regardless? It made no sense, and Betty, who couldn't be sure if it was just poor investigative work or something else, but the truck wasn't the only searched area that the worried mother found strange. Betty had previously stated that on the Wednesday she reported her daughter missing, that she'd stopped by her home to see if she was there, or if she could find any clues. Inside the home, she saw no signs of a struggle and noted that her daughter's clothes and personal items were all still there. When cadaver dogs were brought into search, she once again returned to the home to get some clothes so the dogs could pick up Peggy's scent. But on this visit, she was shocked to discover that all of her daughter's clothing and bedding had been washed. Her shoes were missing, along with her perfume, soaps, shampoo, and toothbrush. All of her overnight items were gone. She confronted McIntosh about this, who replied that his mother had cleaned everything to help out, and no further explanation was given. Betty has no idea what became of her daughter's possessions, including her phone, jewelry, purse, wallet, and checkbook. None of those items have ever been found. While these searches were some of the most massive investigative steps taken since Peggy was reported missing, they did not result in a major advancement of the case. The items recovered, while alluring, didn't seem to aid investigators to further their probe. Sheriff Ledbetter went on to state that though multiple attempts had been made, the security footage they possessed could not be enhanced enough to help identify the unknown man seen leaving Peggy's truck at the bar the morning after she was last seen alive. At that point, Ledbetter noted the OSBI was taking over the day-to-day operations of the investigation. Asked about the status of the case in early March, 5 months after the disappearance, OSBI spokesperson Jessica Brown said there were no new updates to share. There would be few words from officials for months. Wednesday, November 16, 2016, marked 1 full year since Peggy had last been seen alive. According to the OSBI, to that point, they had made more than 140 investigative reports on the case and were still actively investigating, performing a search of a culvert area as recently as 2 days earlier. Unfortunately, they still hadn't found enough to move the case forward, nor could they name a suspect or a person of interest. For the family, the passage of a year was a grim anniversary that only worked to highlight the likelihood that they may never see Peggy again. But they were undeterred in their drive to find her. Speaking to the media, Betty explained, saying, quote, "My daughter was in our life every day. I'm not going to stop talking about her because I'm her voice. I try to live my life, work. I still try to function. Her birthday is coming up, and that makes it hard. Hopefully, one of these days, she'll get justice. There's no way she would just leave." End quote. A Bring Peggy Home service was held earlier in the month at the First Free Will Baptist Church. There was a potluck dinner, and they released 500 balloons, many with messages for or about Peggy. Friends and family shared memories and stories while everyone sat down to a large dinner together, a direct attempt to keep her name and memory alive. It was announced at the time that a reward for information had been dramatically increased, totaling $50,000. Several months later, in May of 2017, Billy Taylor, the owner of a chain of medical labs in Arkansas who had met and spent time with Peggy previously, announced that he was putting up an additional $100,000 reward for information. Taylor said he would even pay the reward out to the person responsible so long as the information led to Peggy's whereabouts. This, combined, raised the total reward for information up to $150,000. As if this wasn't enough grief and pain for the family to experience, Betty found herself embroiled in several different legal cases revolving around her daughter's property and, most importantly, her grandson. McIntosh had stopped allowing Betty to see or spend time with Ethan, so she filed in court to be granted visitation. Being that McIntosh is native, his lawyers tried to get the case transferred to the Creek Nation, but a judge overruled this, noting that if the case was for custody, then it would have to go to the nation, but being that this was about visitation, his court held jurisdiction. Seemingly in direct response to the filing for visitation, McIntosh filed a civil suit claiming that 4 months before Peggy's disappearance, in July of 2015, Betty had sold 4 of his cattle in excess of $4,372 at the Cross Livestock auction. He also alleged that Betty had stolen other cattle from him, in excess of $10,000. In regard to visitation, McIntosh fought against it, stating that Betty had made untrue statements about him and his involvement in the disappearance, citing this as the reason he did not want his son around her. As part of her petition, Betty requested that law enforcement agencies in the area be subpoenaed to determine whether or not McIntosh was in fact fit to be a parent to the boy. With things getting heated on both sides, a judge removed Ethan from his father and had him placed in the custody of a guardian ad litem. Later, McIntosh filed paternity documents seeking full custody of his son, noting that he was his biological father and claiming in those documents that Peggy had willfully abandoned her son. Betty denied that her daughter would have ever abandoned her son, stating in her response filing that Ethan could suffer physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his father without the assignment of court-ordered visitation rights. In the end, McIntosh would win, with Betty telling Unfound that he is Ethan's biological father and grandparents' rights do not compare to those, at least not under Oklahoma state law. She has not seen her grandson since shortly after her daughter's disappearance. May of 2018 marked 2.5 years since Peggy disappeared. While local stories about the case had been slowly drying up, Betty was contacted by producers for Crime Watch Daily, who decided to cover the case. They came to Eufaula early in the month to film locations and conduct interviews with the family, as well as law enforcement. Although Thomas McIntosh would not sit for an on-camera interview, his lawyer, Keith McCarter, would. Jenny Verdon would represent the OSBI, while Betty and Elizabeth Leeper spoke for the family. Betty was excited about the promise of more extensive coverage, telling local papers, quote, "The case is getting cold. People are forgetting. We need to keep her memory alive. Maybe one day, my daughter will get justice." End quote. Several new details were released in this coverage. First, it was stated that both Peggy and McIntosh's phones pinged within close proximity to each other near to the home they shared on the morning of the disappearance. There was also a report from a neighbor who told authorities that he saw McIntosh driving a tractor onto he and Peggy's property shortly after she is believed to have disappeared. The neighbor, a bus driver who had come home for lunch as he always did, stated that when the tractor drove off of the property, it was moving quickly and had its bucket lifted all the way up, making it impossible to see what, if anything, might be in the bucket. The neighbor speculated that perhaps Peggy's body was in that bucket, though the OSBI was unable to confirm this, as they can't even confirm if the witness saw this happening the day of the disappearance or, as has been argued by Kevin McCarter, the day before. McIntosh's lawyer argued that the bus driver's sighting occurred on Sunday, telling Crime Watch Daily, quote, "That would be the day before. He was moving some hay to prepare for the rains to come. That was on Sunday. So if the neighbor says that was on Monday or Tuesday, that's just incorrect." End quote. McCarter, to his credit, answered a lot of questions asked about the disappearance and his client's involvement, or lack thereof. When asked about a history of violence and abuse from McIntosh towards Peggy, McCarter argued that much of that was overblown or, in some cases, fabricated. He explained, quote, "Have you seen any medical records about it? There aren't any. These are kind of small-town legends that develop, and a lot of them develop after someone disappears. It's a nice narrative. Unfortunately, the facts just don't corroborate. There was an incident where he was arrested on some allegation of domestic violence. The case was eventually dropped. I know that there are people down there who are hell-bent for Thomas to be charged. There's not enough evidence to prove a murder case beyond a reasonable doubt, and they would be charging an innocent man." End quote. McCarter went on to note that even with enhancement attempts from the OSBI, no one could positively identify the individual seen in the surveillance footage, with him commenting that, whether you like it or not, the video is so unclear you can't prove it was Thomas McIntosh, and in fact, you can't even say with complete certainty that it's not Peggy herself. Obviously, the family strongly disagrees with Peggy's father, stating that, in his opinion, based on how the unidentified person walked, he has no doubt it's Thomas McIntosh. Asked whether or not she believes McIntosh was involved, Betty replied emphatically, quote, "Yes, because I know how he was. I've heard his threats. He's broke her nose. He's done so much to her. She was dating. He didn't want another man to be around his son." End quote. Jenny Verdon of the OSBI was also interviewed. When asked about a suspect or person of interest, she was more neutral in her response, giving no specific details. She said, quote, "Everyone's a person of interest in this case until Peggy McGuire is found." End quote. Though not wanting to speak too negatively about the early investigation, Verdon did note that it would have been more helpful if they had been called in to assist earlier, since the timing was so important. She went on to say that samples taken from the home and tractor, which were described as blood-like, were too degraded by the time they were collected and therefore could not be properly identified. Asked about the story, which claimed that Ethan stated his father had told him Peggy ran off with another man before her truck was found at the bar, Verdon stated they were not able to confirm that account. Keith McCarter was adamant that this was a contrived account, saying, quote, "Ethan never disclosed a comment like that to anybody from the Department of Human Services, never disclosed a comment like that to his attorney in the case, never disclosed a comment like that to the guardian ad litem in the case." End quote. The last major news in this case came about in the early part of 2024, just last year, when an anonymous tipster reached out to a local reporter. According to the tipster, he knew where Peggy's remains may have been hidden. The reporter, Shay Rozzi, immediately reached out to Steve Money, a defense attorney, who then reached out to Bert Poole, an investigator with the Muskogee County District Attorney's Office. The original tip, reported in February, stated that Peggy's body was wrapped in chicken wire and then weighted down with cinder blocks before being placed into a pond south of Washington Avenue in the town of Oktaha, located approximately 35 miles northeast of Peggy's home along Highway 69. Bert Poole was clear with reporters that the tip was received from someone who knew Peggy prior to her disappearance. He explained, quote, "There were some people that knew Peggy back in 2015. They were hearing stuff. They were talking amongst themselves at one place or the other. One gentleman has moved away, and he's the person that's been calling us and saying, you might want to go to Oktaha and check the pond. I believe she's going to be there." End quote. The Muskogee County Sheriff's Office, in addition to the Light Horse Police, conducted a search of the pond for just over 3 hours, but they did not locate any evidence or signs of Peggy. They noted at the time that they would likely return to the pond for a more focused and deeper search when the weather made that a possibility. 2 months later, investigators lived up to their word And on Friday, April 5th, investigators returned to the pond, which they noted this time as being in the backyard of a local resident. Betty and Donnie made the trip for McIntosh County to watch the search. Investigators brought along a pump so that they could lower the water level in the pond, believing that Peggy's remains may be buried in the mud at the bottom. Watching on in hushed anticipation, Betty explained her feelings to reporters, saying, quote, "My stomach went churning. I had a little hope. They say she ran off. She didn't run off. She would not leave her little boy or family. It's an awful feeling." End quote. As the water was pumped out from the pond, a nearby creek was catching the runoff, and this caused the creek to begin overflowing, forcing law enforcement to turn the pump off. With the water lowered enough, searchers began digging down into the muddy earth, but ultimately, they couldn't find anything connected to their investigation. Asked about the likelihood that Peggy's body was down there somewhere, the family stated that they didn't think it was likely, but they do wholeheartedly believe someone in the area knows what happened to Peggy and where her remains might be. Unfortunately, until one of them comes forward, that search will never end. Betty explained, quote, "We know there are a few people who know where she's at, and I hope it eats up their heart. Hopefully one day there will be closure." End quote. When last seen, Peggy Anne McGuire was described as being a woman of dual heritage, white and native, enrolled with the Muskogee Creek Nation. Peggy has shoulder-length, wavy, strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes. She stands 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighs approximately 150 to 160 pounds. Peggy wears a size 10 shoe and has pierced ears. She has a surgery scar on her right knee and a tattoo on her lower back depicting a horseshoe with stars and a 4-leaf clover with the initials JNS, which are partially faded. She was last confirmed to have been seen on the morning of Monday, November 16, 2015, in Canadian, Oklahoma, dropping her son off for school at around 8 a.m. It's believed that she returned to her Stidham home after dropping him off. She has never been seen again. At the time of her disappearance, Peggy was 28 years old, and if alive today, she'd be turning 39 this November. A $150,000 reward remains in place for information leading to recovery of her remains. Peggy McGuire was a beautiful, talented, caring, and driven nurse, daughter, and mother. She loved being a mom to young Ethan, and her entire world revolved around doing everything she could to try and create the best life for him. At work, she bent over backwards to take care of her patients, and at home, she worked hard from morning till night, taking care of her farm and beloved animals. She was, according to everyone who knew her, one of the most wonderful and kind people you could ever hope to meet. Sadly, her life was cut short for reasons no one has yet determined, and this November will mark not only her 39th birthday, but 10 years since she was last seen alive. Her son is nearly an adult, but never really got to know the mother who loved him more than anything else. Though a mystery shrouds the truth, someone out there knows, and their silence continues to rob a family of closure, a woman of justice, and a son of his mother's love. Asked about the loss of her daughter nearly a decade later, Betty replied, quote, "Holidays were always a big deal for us. We'd have a big dinner, and it just isn't the same anymore. I don't think she's still alive." Peggy had no reason to leave her family or son. We just hang in there. Don't give up. One day you'll have answers, or maybe you have your loved one. Just hoping that day comes soon. We just want closure, basically, and we hope one day we'll get that. The disappearance of Peggy McGuire is a heartbreaking and frustrating case for which no solid evidence-based answers have ever been provided. The frustration comes not from a lack of theories or speculation, not from the absence of clues or indications of what likely occurred, but more so from the failure of law enforcement to act with urgency and focus, or perhaps, as some might argue, to act in any way whatsoever. When Peggy was reported missing, her case was treated as though she'd randomly elected to run off, leaving behind all of her belongings, her entire family, the job she loved, and the house she was working on, in addition to the most important person in her life, her one and only son. The snail's pace at which law enforcement conducted their initial investigation, and I use the term investigation loosely, did more to hamper this case than anything else. Even the OSBI, who tried to answer as politely and politically as they could, were forced to admit that maybe if they had been called into the case earlier, there would have been some hope of finding answers, or at least obtaining evidence solid enough to identify and name a suspect, or even a person of interest. But that didn't happen here. They weren't called in for weeks, and during the period leading up to their involvement, it's anyone's guess how much evidence may have been destroyed or hidden up to and including Peggy's remains. For weeks, the family were stuck doing the investigation themselves. They put up flyers, interviewed friends and family, offered rewards, and carried out searches. They searched on foot, with ATVs, using drones, and they got everyone they could involved. Family members traveled in from out of state, neighbors dedicated their time and energy to helping out, and even complete strangers, just locals living in and around the area, gave what time and effort they could to try and help out. They began their searches at Peggy's home, then started expanding into her property, and then, with permission, onto the property of neighbors. As they were doing this, local law enforcement noted they couldn't search anywhere because they didn't have a starting point. Then, when the family searches continued to grow with more and more people joining in, law enforcement advised them to stop the searches altogether. Why? Because if they did find anything, they could contaminate evidence or the scene. A legitimate concern, no doubt, but if they weren't going to search themselves, the family sure wasn't planning to just sit around waiting. When the OSBI did finally get involved, not by the way a result of law enforcement reaching out early on, but from a conglomeration of different sources, including the family begging them for help and a local reporter contacting them about the case, things were already rather cold. Just days after officially getting on the case, the OSBI issued multiple warrants focusing on Peggy's home and property, as well as the properties of surrounding neighbors. They sought information from Peggy's phone and social media, as well as Thomas McIntosh's. Search warrants were executed on her truck, as well as his, and properties owned by the McIntosh family, including the one at which the Kubota tractor was generally kept. During the execution of these warrants, multiple samples of a blood-like substance were recovered from the home, McIntosh's truck, and the tractor, but all of the testing was for naught as too much time had passed and the samples were too degraded to provide any evidentiary value, another consequence of failing to act when the time and circumstances had demanded it. Peggy was last seen on the morning of Monday, November 16th, dropping her son off at school in Canadian. She was last spoken to on the phone between 9 and 10 a.m. From that point forward, her cell phone powers off and all traces of the young mother disappear along with her. For the next 2 days, no one's able to get in touch with Peggy. Her parents reach out through calls and texts but receive no answer. Co-workers do the same, but the phone doesn't even ring. It just goes straight to voicemail. On Wednesday the 18th, after stopping by the house and finding no sign of Peggy or her truck, her mother finally contacts the sheriff's department, who take her report and say they'll keep an eye out for Peggy, but beyond that, nothing's really done. They tell the family that, in all likelihood, she's left of her own volition and will return when she's ready, something that no one who knows the missing woman believes, even for a second. The OSBI, for their part, are generally complimented by the family, who were grateful for their assistance. They executed warrants, collected evidence, and did as much as they could despite being called in late and working with a staff that was, at one point, described as short-handed. However, things weren't perfect there either. Betty had made it clear that when she saw Peggy's truck after it was taken in for processing, it didn't look to her as though they had thoroughly searched the vehicle. She didn't see any dust to suggest there was any fingerprinting done, and when she asked why, she was allegedly informed that since McIntosh was a co-signer on the vehicle and lived with Peggy, they would fully expect to find his prints in the truck, so why bother checking at all, right? This never made any sense to me. Even if a lawyer could argue away the presence of those prints, what if you found prints that belonged to someone else or some unidentified third party? Seems rather ridiculous to ignore potential evidence, especially when, and I should make this very clear, McIntosh has never been named as a suspect or a person of interest. Why a more thorough job wasn't done, I simply don't know. Since this case is so wide open, it's almost impossible to speculate about too many possibilities because almost anything could have happened. Rather than toying around with different angles, let's just focus in on what everyone's been talking about since day one: Thomas McIntosh. Now, before going any further, let me preface the rest of this episode by saying all claims are alleged in my speculation or opinion, other than those details which have already been established as fact by law enforcement during the course of this investigation. I've covered a handful of cases like this one, in the sense that law enforcement is fenced in by what they are and are not allowed to say. Family, friends, and locals have no such restraint, and over the last 10 years, they've been pretty open about what they believe. Peggy's mother has been clear and direct from the beginning that she believes Thomas McIntosh was involved in her daughter's disappearance, and given what's been said and established about their relationship history, it's difficult to see much error in her point of view or beliefs. We know that Peggy was caught up in a vicious cycle of violence and abuse, at least as pertains to the opinions of friends and family who, at the time, were in the position to know. It's been stated that, going back to high school, McIntosh was violent, jealous, and a controlling man who could fly into a rage if Peggy were merely seen speaking to another guy, let alone flirting or anything beyond that. We have a lot of stories about things that are alleged to have happened, from physical abuse to the destruction of property, smashing car windows, kicking in doors, etc. Suffice it to say, there's a very clear circumstantial trail created based purely on past behaviors that have to be factored into the circumstances leading up to Peggy's disappearance. So, let's take a look at what we know about Peggy's last hours and see how the wind is blowing in the aftermath. Peggy's living with McIntosh in a home she bought that he co-signed on, and she's driving a truck that she bought that he also co-signed on. According to friends and family, she was trying to do everything she could to provide her son with a real family, while also telling McIntosh that their relationship moving forward was going to be all about their son. She was done with any romantic aspects, and they would have no future together outside of something platonic. It was alleged that despite this, McIntosh continued to try and convince Peggy to date again or to get back together, but she was resistant and had even started seeing other people, like the guy from Texas. They kept living together in the Stidham home, but they maintained separate bedrooms and reportedly kept to their own parts of the dwelling. Peggy had reportedly told one of her cousins that she was planning to get away from McIntosh for good, to move out of the house and in with her mother while she looked for a new place to start over. It's not made clear, but it seems apparent that this was not information she shared with McIntosh in advance, and therefore any efforts by her to move out would be handled quietly. At one point, it said that she was planning to take the next weekend off so she could begin moving things out without McIntosh knowing, but how much of that was true versus wishful thinking is unknown. As of the morning of Monday, November 16th, we know that Peggy was seeing another man and was taking the following day off to spend time with them. Law enforcement would later speak to this man, who gave them details about his last conversation with Peggy, but there are questions to which the answers have never been supplied. Was this man aware of Peggy's living arrangements and history with McIntosh, or was that a subject she purposefully steered clear of when they spoke? It would be deeply insightful to know what, if anything, This guy may have been told or intuited about their relationship, the status of things between them at the time, and any future plans Peggy may have had about leaving. It's quite apparent, assuming all of the claims about abuse and violence are legitimate, that the situation between Peggy and McIntosh was a powder keg rife for explosion, and all it was going to take was the slightest spark. Betty Davis later told reporters that she was very concerned for her daughter's safety, and even raised the topic with her. Reportedly, Peggy replied that she had enough information on McIntosh to take him for everything he was worth, should he decide to try and do something to her. In the end, however, whatever she had may not have been enough, and she may have underestimated to what extent he was willing to go should the circumstances shift in a way he didn't like. We know that Peggy always dropped off and picked up her son from school. There was a list which she had provided to administrators of those who were approved to pick Ethan up, should she not be available. Notably absent from that list was Thomas McIntosh, who family and friends have said never picked Ethan up from school. Following the morning of the 16th, when Peggy mysteriously vanished, it's been reported that McIntosh called the school, told them he would be picking up his son late, and that he was doing so because Peggy was stuck working. This is the first major question in the case for which no answer has ever been supplied, but if McIntosh told law enforcement that he last saw Peggy when she was leaving that morning, how did he know she wouldn't be able to pick up their son that afternoon? For the record, she was off that day and the next day, so she certainly wasn't working late. After this, we know from phone conversations that Peggy drove home to Stidham and returned to her house. According to the guy from Texas that she was seeing, and who is also the last person to speak to her, she was in the process of making deer jerky for him. He was planning to come up into Oklahoma that night to spend time with Peggy, but for work reasons, he ended up having to cancel. Peggy, however, never learned about the cancellation, as when the man tried to call her back that morning, her phone went straight to voicemail. OSBI records later showed that on the morning of her disappearance, Peggy's phone was pinging in the area surrounding her house, and Thomas McIntosh's phone was pinging in close proximity to it. Due to the state of that cell phone data, it's not enough to narrow down to a sharply specific location, so all that can be said is that their phones were within the same coverage area. Obviously, that isn't enough information to confirm that McIntosh was at the house that morning when Peggy got back, but one must wonder where exactly he claimed to be that morning and who or what provided the alibi. This detail has never been revealed, if in fact it is known. For the next 2 days, Peggy's just gone. She doesn't go home, answer her phone, respond to texts, and no one sees her in or around town. The guy from Texas can't get in touch with her, and since he doesn't make the trip, he never sees her. According to Betty, during this period of time and leading all the way up to the discovery of Peggy's truck the day after she's reported missing, for reasons no one can quite explain, McIntosh doesn't try to get in touch with her at all. He doesn't call, he doesn't text, he doesn't do anything. It's rather interesting that these two lived together and co-parented and presumably were in touch when need be, but after she disappears, he doesn't consider it worth trying to track her down or get in touch with her. Some would speculate that this is a behavior common in offenders who have no reason to reach out because they already know there's no one capable of answering. For the record, Peggy's phone has never been found. Peggy's truck is found by her brother at T&J's Ice House, a bar 10 miles from the Stidham home that Peggy reportedly never visited. In fact, it said she doesn't even drink alcohol. Surveillance footage shows an unknown individual dropping the truck off in the early morning hours of Tuesday, November 17th, less than 24 hours after Peggy is last seen. The quality of the video is extremely poor, making it difficult to make out anything beyond general shapes. In the footage, an unknown individual is seen exiting the truck and walking back out of the parking lot, out of range of the camera. This person is later spotted by a neighbor but ducks into the weeds along the side of the road as she approaches in her vehicle, so she doesn't get a good look either. While the OSBI tried to enhance the footage, they were unable to do so. Curiously, This footage has never been released in full to the public, which I find somewhat odd. It's been 10 years. Why don't you share it? Not to mention, with advancements that have been made in video editing software, you'd think someone might actually be able to sharpen it up, but that hasn't happened yet. The family firmly believes that the person seen in the video is McIntosh, although I must admit, I can barely see anything in that video. It's kind of a mess. It was raining, and the video is very pixelated and of poor quality. I don't think you can identify someone on that camera unless they walk up to within 10 feet of it and look straight into the lens, and even then you might have some doubts about who it could possibly be. Now, according to the family, McIntosh came down to the bar while police were there, and he was interviewed by a deputy. It gets reported that he claims to have not seen Peggy since she left to drop Ethan off at school, and he theorizes that she ran off with another guy. We really aren't privy to any information more detailed than that. There is a claim that Ethan says his father showed him the truck at the bar and was told that his mother had run off with another guy before the truck was officially found and reported to law enforcement, but that statement, if indeed it was made, is not repeated and can't be backed up by anyone. So whether or not he said it, I simply don't know. After this, everything is really circumstantial and more speculative than we've already seen. A neighbor claims to see McIntosh operating a tractor on the property that morning/early afternoon. He claims the bucket is high up and he theorizes that perhaps Peggy's body was in there, but no one knows. McIntosh's lawyer notes that the neighbor is mistaken and that McIntosh drove the tractor the day before the disappearance, Sunday the 15th. Even if the neighbor is accurate in seeing the tractor that day, it does little to lend any support to the claim that McIntosh was involved in Peggy's disappearance. Unless the witness actually saw something incriminating, his count doesn't amount to much. Some have wondered, and I along with them, why McIntosh would decide to move the body in that way if indeed that's what he was doing. He could have easily waited until night and done so under the cover of darkness, where maybe no one would have seen anything, but we simply don't know. The OSBI gets their warrants and they collect a few pieces of evidence, namely swabs from blood-like stains on the couch and back porch, as well as inside of McIntosh's truck, but because of their condition and the passage of time, the evidence provides nothing of substance. A gun is recovered, and while that was intriguing, there's no comments made about the condition of it. Had it been fired recently? Did any of the chambers hold a spent round? Again, no solid answers. Law enforcement says they are pieces of a puzzle, and it would all make sense later. But 10 years have gone by, and it still makes no sense to me. That's kind of where it all ends. Just days into the investigation, and they're already hitting a dead end with the case growing cold. Some have speculated that the reason law enforcement was slow to act was because of the name of the man implicated, McIntosh. It's worth noting they're in McIntosh County, named after his ancestor, and his family has power, money, and prestige. Could that have been enough to steer police out of the way, or at least to have slowed down the investigation? Possibly. It's difficult to say, and that's sort of one of the sticking points of this case, I think. Getting caught up in the semantics of what might have been rather than focusing on what certainly was. Personally, I think there are much more direct and black and white details to pay attention to that spell things out much more clearly than any rumors about corruption might be. If my ex-girlfriend, the woman I lived with, the mother of my child, went missing, there are things I wouldn't do. I'd be out there beating the bushes searching for her, putting up flyers, trying to get attention on the case. I'd be spending time with her family, supporting them, and doing what I could to help. I'd be on the news talking to reporters, giving interviews, trying to keep the story alive. I'd be working with law enforcement, telling them everything I knew and trying my hardest to aid them in their investigation, probably to the point where they'd find me a bit annoying. I'd be online, posting on social media, making YouTube videos to garner attention. I'd be going to my wealthy family and asking them for help, be it monetary or volunteering for searches. I'd be telling my son that his mother loved him and would never have abandoned him, not for any reason or any other person on the face of this earth. So why doesn't McIntosh do these things? Why doesn't he seem interested in helping or even remotely concerned about her well-being and safety? Why am I, a complete stranger who has never met Peggy, doing more right now than the father of her son has ever done to advance this case, keep this story alive, and spread the word of Peggy's disappearance? If you can find the answer to those questions, then maybe you'll have some idea of just what in the hell happened here, although I imagine you already do. This isn't a mysterious disappearance. It's a murder investigation where only one name comes up time and time and time again, and yet nothing is ever done to dig deeper to find the truth. Would you lie to protect your brother to cover up a murder? How about your son or your cousin or your uncle? How far would you be willing to go? How much horror could you swallow down to keep a killer free? And just what happens if, one day, that killer strikes again? How would you ever wash all of that blood from your hands? That's a question certain people in this case need to answer. Nearly 10 years have passed since Peggy Anne McGuire vanished on the morning of November 16th, 2015. In all the time that's passed, few developments have been revealed and little progress has been made. There is one thing on which the family and law enforcement all agree. Someone out there knows the truth. Someone out there has the answers that can help bring justice, or at a minimum, to give a family the chance to lay their loved one to rest, where they might finally be granted the ability to grieve without the nagging questions of where is she and what happened to her. $150,000 reward. $150,000 is a hell of a lot of money. For me, and I imagine for a lot of others, that is life-changing cash to be awarded for information leading to the recovery of Peggy's remains. Now, either someone is too scared to collect that money, or maybe everyone who knows the truth has a lot more money than that at their disposal. Either way, unless someone comes forward or new evidence is found, the disappearance of Peggy McGuire will remain open, unsolved, and growing cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Peggy McGuire, there are many news sites and forums detailing her case. For this episode, both the Indian Journal and McIntosh County Democrat were the most helpful. Peggy's case has been featured on other podcasts, and her mother, Betty, sat for an interview on Unfound, which I highly recommend listening to. There's a link in the show notes. The family maintains a private Facebook group entitled Bring Peggy Home. You can request to join, but they're very selective about who they let in, and I was unable to gain access. If you have any information about the disappearance of Peggy McGuire, please contact the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation Southeast Investigative Regional Office at 580-298-5525. Her case number is 2015-1475. You can also contact the McIntosh County Sheriff's Office at 918-689-2526. She is case number 15-0925. Finally, you can reach out to Oklahoma Crime Stoppers at 1-855-975-7233 or by visiting okcrimestoppers.com. There, you can report information completely anonymously should you desire to. Remember, a $150,000 reward for information leading to Peggy's location remains available. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com or comment in the Facebook group. You can find all social media and contact links in the show notes. Now I'd like to take a moment to shout out and thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom this podcast would not be possible. Andrew Guarino, Anne Bertram, Christine Greco, Crystal J, Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, Leslie B, Lisa Hobson, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Stacy Finnegan, and Tom Radford. Your continued support and confidence means the world to me, and you are what makes Trace Evidence possible. If you would like to support Trace Evidence on Patreon, you can visit us at patreon.com/traceevidence. This concludes our look into the disappearance of Peggy McGuire, an extremely solvable case that remains a mystery for now, but I honestly believe this case will be solved sooner than later, or at least I sincerely hope so. I want to thank you all for listening and apologize about my horrible schedule of late, but I am working on episode 248 currently and aim to release it next week. So, once again, thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.